The barbed wire gleamed in the sunlight, stretched taut across wide American fields that had never before seen German boots. Prisoners stepped down from the trains, gaunt from battle yet still carrying the stiff pride of soldiers. The silence was startling. No bombs, no sirens, no columns of smoke, only the creak of train wheels fading into the distance and the low murmur of guards calling roll. For many, this was their first glimpse of America, a land once caricatured in propaganda as weak and decadent. Instead, they found endless skies, rows of corn stretching to the horizon, and camps that seemed less like cages and more like small, orderly towns. The arrival was both humiliating and bewildering. Some prisoners whispered among themselves about what they had been told America was supposed to be: chaotic, divided, incapable of standing against the Reich. Yet here they were, confronted with clean uniforms, firm discipline, and guards who treated them not with cruelty, but with brisk efficiency. A few POWs noted in diaries how shocked they were to be given hot meals within hours of capture, coffee steaming in tin mugs, bread softer than anything they had eaten in months, and meat that felt almost luxurious after the shortages of Europe. Rumors spread quickly. One man swore he had seen a camp stocked with library shelves taller than any officer's bookcase back home. Another laughed bitterly at the sight of American guards throwing away cigarette butts longer than what German officers now rationed. These were not grand political revelations, but small humiliations, each detail chiseling away at the myths they had once believed. And then came the gossip that rippled through the ranks. A captured officer, hardened on the Eastern Front, had gone silent when he saw a black American guard carrying himself with authority, commanding respect from white soldiers. For men steeped in the ideology of racial superiority, it was not just a shock, it was an earthquake under their worldview. The first nights were restless. The men lay in their bunks, listening to the sound of trains passing in the distance, whistles echoing like ghosts of the war they had left behind. Some clung to dreams of a quick German victory and release. Others began to sense that captivity in this land would be unlike any story they had been told. Within weeks, the camps began to shift from sterile enclosures into something uncanny, fragments of Germany transplanted into the American landscape. Prisoners were not content to simply wait out their days staring at fences. They dug into the soil, planting neat rows of vegetables, cabbage, carrots, potatoes tended with the same discipline they had once given to military drills. Soon, gardens flourished, and the camp kitchen smelled of fresh soups that tasted faintly of home. Inside the barracks, resourcefulness turned scraps into comforts. Sheets of cardboard became chessboards, with pieces carved from bread hardened in the sun. A corner of one hut rang with harmonicas, another with violins crafted from scavenged wood. In the evenings, men sang folk songs in low voices, the melodies drifting into the night like whispers of villages left behind. Guards sometimes paused in their rounds, listening in silence before moving on. There was gossip here too, quiet talk about a bakery in one camp where prisoners managed to bake rye bread so fragrant that even American guards lined up to taste it. One diary tells of a prisoner who had once been a pastry chef in Cologne, now kneading dough in captivity, his hands remembering movements more precise than any drill sergeant's command. A rumor spread of another camp where POWs had built an improvised beer hall, serving a weak but cherished brew from fermented fruit. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories carried through the fences, feeding hope. The villages within the wire grew more elaborate. Flower pots appeared on windowsills, carved wooden crucifixes on barrack walls, even makeshift theaters where dramas were staged by men who had once fought across deserts and forests. In some camps, the illusion of normality was so complete that newcomers gasped in disbelief, as if they had stumbled into a miniature homeland. Yet the strangeness was undeniable. Beyond the fences lay not German hills but endless American plains, punctuated by the distant whistle of freight trains carrying steel, coal, and wheat. The contrast was jarring inside. Prisoners recreated the past. Outside, America thundered into the future. The nights grew quieter, softer, almost domestic. Men wrote letters beneath dim bulbs, describing how their days now echoed with laughter and song rather than artillery. But every diary page carried the same undertone. This was not freedom, merely a fragile shadow of it. The part closes on a slow image, a row of gardens blooming under watchtowers, flowers nodding in the breeze as if mocking the wire that surrounded them. When the gates opened each morning and work details marched out, the prisoners encountered something far more astonishing than the gardens behind the wire. They were led into fields that stretched farther than the eye could follow, rows of wheat taller than their waists, cornfields wider than German provinces, to men who had grown up on farms squeezed between forests and villages. This abundance seemed surreal, as though America itself were a land without limits. Assigned to local farms, many POWs bent over soil beside American laborers. They noticed details that stung with irony: farm wives carrying lunchboxes filled with sandwiches and fruit more plentiful than rations once reserved for Wehrmacht officers. A prisoner scribbled in his journal how an American farmer casually poured milk for pigs, an extravagance unthinkable in Germany, where children lined up with ration cards for a thin cup. Each gesture reminded them that what propaganda had called weakness was in truth prosperity. In factories, the shock was sharper still. The noise of conveyor belts roared like artillery barrages, but instead of destruction, they produced tractors, harvesters, and crates of canned goods. Prisoners watched steel sparks flying, rivet guns hammering in perfect rhythm, workers pausing only to sip coffee from thermoses and return to their machines. "They make more in a day than we did in a month," one man muttered, his voice swallowed by the din. The gossip spread like wildfire, a B-24 bomber rolling off assembly lines every 63 minutes, ships welded together faster than a week's worth of German labor. At night, inside the camps, men reenacted what they had seen, waving arms in mimicry of the assembly line, half mocking, half awed. An older sergeant admitted quietly to a companion that he had not believed America could fight on two fronts until he saw crates marked for both Europe and the Pacific leaving the same factory yard. And then there was the unspoken moment: a German officer, once loud in his disdain for inferior peoples, falling silent when he saw black and white workers operating side by side on the same machines, earning the same wages. That silence rippled through the camp louder than any speech. The days left the men exhausted, but at night their minds churned. For some, the contrast fueled resentment. For others, doubt. They had seen America's hand of industry, its breadbasket fields, its tireless engines. The myth of weakness lay shattered. As the part closes, the camera lingers on the image of an endless train of grain cars rolling toward the horizon, the whistle echoing like a prophecy of a war already decided. Behind the fences, harmony was never guaranteed. The camps became divided worlds, where loyalties and doubts collided in whispers, arguments, and at times fists. Some prisoners remained fiercely devoted to the ideology that had carried them across Europe. They painted swastikas in hidden corners of the barracks, scrawled slogans in notebooks, and tried to maintain military discipline. Others, shaken by what they had seen in American farms and factories, began to question everything they had been told. This tension simmered daily. A prisoner who lingered too long over an American newspaper might return to the barracks with bruises, punishment for daring to absorb enemy lies. Rumors spread of secret courts, organized by the diehards, where suspected traitors were threatened or beaten. In one camp, a man who spoke too freely about the abundance of America was found with his bedding slashed to ribbons, a silent warning in the night. Yet the cracks widened. Letters home revealed subtler betrayals, men writing to their families that captivity was not hardship, but strange comfort. One wrote that he had eaten more meat in a week than in the last year in Germany. Another admitted shame when he realized American guards sometimes wasted bread he would have hidden in his coat back home. These private confessions fueled suspicion among the hardliners, deepening the divide. And then came the gossip, sharp as broken glass, in Texas. Prisoners whispered about an officer who had once barked commands in Africa but now quietly tended tomato plants in the camp garden, preferring the company of dirt to political arguments elsewhere. Men joked nervously about a corporal who argued so fiercely with fellow prisoners that the guards had to intervene. What had begun as a war against an external enemy now twisted inward, camp against camp, man against man. The guards watched carefully, sometimes amused, sometimes uneasy. They saw prisoners who once marched in lockstep now split into factions, some clinging to old loyalties, others daring to imagine a world beyond them. Within the wire, Germany itself seemed to fracture, compressed into a miniature reflection of its larger collapse. The part closes not with a statistic, but with a psychological image, the glow of a single bulb in a barrack. swaying slightly as men argue in hushed tones below. The bulb flickers, then steadies, as if mocking their fragile certainties. If captivity had begun as humiliation. By the midpoint of the war, the camps had transformed into improbable communities, what outsiders called prisons. The men themselves increasingly called villages. They erected schools where former teachers sketched grammar lessons on chalkboards scrounged from shipping crates. In corners of barracks, professors held improvised lectures on history, mathematics, and even philosophy, their voices filling spaces once haunted by silence. It was as if knowledge itself had become another form of resistance against despair. Music rose alongside study, orchestras formed from scrap instruments, their concerts filling yards with echoes of Beethoven and Schubert, carrying nostalgia across barbed wire. Guards sometimes brought their families to listen, uneasy yet fascinated by this flowering of culture behind fences. The gossip spread in one camp. A choir sang so beautifully that a local newspaper reported it, comparing their voices to cathedral choruses of Europe. Theater troupes added another layer. Prisoners stitched costumes from flour sacks, painted backdrops from leftover paint, and performed dramas that blurred the line between satire and survival. Some plays mocked daily camp life, drawing laughter from both guards and prisoners. Others carried a darker edge, retelling stories of betrayal and exile, their symbolism unmistakable, in these little German republics. Democracy itself began to stir, however faintly. Camp committees organized debates, votes on how to allocate rations, even mock elections that played out with surprising seriousness. For men raised under authoritarian command, the experiment carried both hope and irony within captivity. They practiced freedoms forbidden in their homeland. Everyday details anchored this strange normality. A former baker scribbled recipes on scraps of paper, traded like treasure among barracks. Gardeners argued over the best way to rotate crops within the camp soil. There were even quarrels about music, one group insisting on folk songs, another demanding symphonies. Each moment was a fragment of village life transplanted into a world of wire and watchtowers. But the question lingered. For them, and now for us, were these creations acts of survival, or the first stirrings of transformation? Did these miniature republics show what men longed for beneath ideology, or simply what they missed from home? I'll turn to you, the audience, if you were confined far from home. What part of daily life would you fight hardest to recreate? Food, music, or knowledge? Share your thoughts below. The part closes with an image of lanterns glowing across the camp at night, each flicker of light resembling a house in a distant village, fragile but radiant against the darkness. Beyond the fences, the world of America slowly seeped into the lives of the prisoners, not through speeches or propaganda, but through fleeting encounters. POWs marched out to farms, their boots sinking into soil that had never known war. They worked beside American families, sweating under the same sun, harvesting the same wheat. A line blurred here, enemies became fellow laborers, their hands dirtied in unison as baskets filled with corn and crates of apples were hauled away. What shocked the men most was not the work itself, but the gestures surrounding it. One prisoner recalled how a farmer's wife slipped him a slice of pie at lunchtime, as if kindness could cross even barbed wire. Others whispered about children who rode out on bicycles to watch the enemy soldiers labor, only to hand them bottles of milk with shy smiles. Such moments carved deeper cracks into rigid beliefs than any guard tower ever could. In some towns, gossip turned almost unbelievable. It was said that in one camp, POWs played baseball with locals, awkwardly swinging at pitches while farmers cheered. In another, women traded recipes with captured bakers, learning the secrets of German rye bread in exchange for lessons on how to make apple pie. Whether all of it was true hardly mattered. The stories pulsed through the barracks, igniting debates late into the night. Yet not all exchanges were warm. Some guards watched warily, suspicious that too much kindness might soften discipline. And among the prisoners, bitterness still lingered, men who muttered that sharing laughter with Americans was betrayal, that playing games with the enemy dishonored their comrades still dying overseas. Within each man, captivity became a quiet battle between pride and hunger, between ideology and human contact. These encounters left scars and seeds alike. A prisoner could not forget the moment an African-American farmhand offered him a handkerchief in the heat, a gesture that unsettled years of drilled prejudice. Another wrote that he never again saw Americans as caricatures. They were farmers, children, musicians, and workers ordinary people, not faceless enemies. And so I ask you, the audience, if you were behind those fences, would you have reached for that sandwich, played that baseball game, or held back in silence? The part closes on a symbolic image, the setting sun casting long shadows across a field where German prisoners and American farmers work side by side, indistinguishable in the fading light. By 1945, the war's end crept across the horizon like a slow dawn, and with it came the certainty of departure. Camps that had once thrummed with the rhythms of miniature villages now carried an undercurrent of anticipation and unease. Prisoners who had built gardens, orchestras, and schools suddenly found themselves staring at those creations with bittersweet attachment, knowing they would soon be dismantled or abandoned. Some clung to daily rituals more fiercely than ever. A gardener watered his rows of beans even on the morning of repatriation, as if the plants could carry a part of him back across the Atlantic. Musicians held farewell concerts, their violins trembling with notes of longing rather than triumph. Diaries recorded quiet sadness, not only for the families they missed in Germany, but for the strange communities they were about to lose, the little German villages built behind barbed wire. The gossip in these final months took on a reflective tone. Men whispered about who had changed the most, the officer who now kept to himself, the corporal who had taken up English phrases, the baker who swore he would open a cafe if he ever returned home. One rumor told of a prisoner who secretly wept when a farmer's child handed him a drawing of the harvest. A simple sketch he tucked into his rucksack like a relic. Leaving was not triumphant. Prisoners boarded trains again, just as they had on arrival. But the silence now was different. Some gazed through the windows with resentment, eager to shed captivity. Others lingered on the sight of fields rolling endlessly past, knowing they would never see such abundance again. When they reached German soil, the shock reversed itself. Their homeland lay in ruins, cities shattered, factories bombed, families displaced. The abundance of America became a haunting memory, a vision of what might have been, or perhaps what could still be, for some. The experience hardened into silence. For others, it planted seeds that would later grow into support for rebuilding a democratic Germany. The part closes with a lingering image, the abandoned camp gardens, overgrown and silent. Flowers still blooming against the rusting wire, as if mocking the impermanence of captivity and the persistence of life. The story of these camps is not simply one of captivity, but of transformation written in the quiet corners of history, within fences meant to contain. Men rebuilt fragments of home gardens tended like memories, orchestras tuned with trembling hands, classrooms where chalk scratched lessons of another life. What began as humiliation became an odd kind of mirror, reflecting both the fragility of ideology and the resilience of ordinary humanity. The numbers remain vast, hundreds of camps, over 370,000 men scattered across the American landscape. But statistics cannot capture the sound of a violin carved from scrap wood, nor the smell of bread baked from rations stretched with ingenuity. They cannot capture the silence of an officer who once preached superiority but fell mute when offered kindness by a farmhand, or the laughter of children tossing a baseball toward men who had once been feared as enemies. For many prisoners, the return home was harsher than the captivity they left. The Germany they re-entered was scarred, its streets hollow, its promises broken. Yet some carried with them seeds of change, memories of abundance, glimpses of freedom, encounters that suggested another way of living. History often records wars in terms of battles won and lost. Yet here was a different kind of victory, one not fought with guns, but with gardens, classrooms, and human gestures that pierced through prejudice. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the small details. A soldier who later confessed he still dreamed of the sound of rivet guns pounding in American factories. Another who remembered the sweetness of a sandwich offered by a farmer's wife more vividly than any medal he had ever earned. These fragments remind us that history is not only shaped by strategies and leaders, but by fleeting moments of humanity in unexpected places. As we reflect tonight, the barbed wire fades into memory, but the lessons remain. That even in the shadows of war, men built villages where none should have existed. That dignity can grow like a flower against rusting wire, and that captivity, paradoxically, became a window into freedom.